Professor Joseph S. Nye Jr., Chancellor Martin Parkinson AC, Vice Chancellor S. Bruce Dowton MD, Helen Stiles, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, friends all, a very warm welcome to our 2021 Soft Power Oration. I would like to begin our proceedings by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the Macquarie University land, the Watamotagal clan of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land since the Dreamtime. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and future of the Darug Nation and extend that respect to other Indigenous guests from Australia and other lands attending this Zoom conference today. The Soft Power Analysis and Resource Centre at Macquarie University, or in short SPARC, that now hosts this oration series, was inaugurated in April 2012 by none less than Harvard Professor Joseph S. Nye Jr., father of soft power and today's distinguished speaker. Under the leadership of Professor Naren Chitty, SPARC has contributed to soft power theorization by launching the Routledge Handbook of Soft Power project and the new Anthem Studies in Soft Power and Public Diplomacy series. The Routledge Handbook of Soft Power is now held in the foremost university and state libraries in the world and has entered editorial production of its second edition. SPARC has been very successful in attracting external research funding. It has run research projects and conferences and been associated with the research of a dozen PhD candidates. Currently, the Centre is developing a project proposal on migration and soft power for external funding. The Soft Power Oration lecture series was created in honor of Bruce Allen, who was teaching at Macquarie University at the time he passed away. He had earlier made pioneering contributions to current affairs TV production at the ABC, to the international activities of the then Australian Film, Television and Radio School, and to policy development at the Australian Broadcasting Tribunal. He was a founding director of Television Australia, Australia's public diplomacy TV broadcaster. He also directed the late night lineup at the BBC and worked at ABC on This Day Tonight and Four Corners. Bruce's widow, Helen Stiles, an immigration lawyer, former Australian diplomat and journalist, has graced us with her presence at all orations in the series since the inception in 2003 of the Bruce Allen Memorial Lecture Series. I'm pleased to say that Helen, who has also taught at Macquarie University, is here with us again today. I now have the very pleasant task to introduce our Vice Chancellor and President, Professor S. Bruce Dowton, MD. Professor Dowton was appointed Vice Chancellor and President of Macquarie University in 2012 and has since led the development of a comprehensive strategy to secure the university's renown in education and discovery based on a concept of service and engagement. Professor Dowton will preside over today's event. Professor Bruce Dowton.
Thanks very much, Martina, and a warm welcome to all participating. It's my great pleasure today to introduce to you all Emeritus Professor Joseph S. Nye Jr., University Distinguished Service Professor at Harvard University, former Dean of the Kennedy School of Government, educated at Princeton University and then as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University. Leading scholar, has published many volumes and a novel indeed around foreign policy. Has served a career of great distinction, serving in senior leadership roles at the National Intelligence Council, the United States government, and as a senior member of the United States Department of State. It's a great pleasure today to introduce such an influential scholar of foreign policy to speak to us. Welcome, Professor Nye. I now invite you to deliver the soft power oration. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dowton. And let me say that I find it a pleasure to be back at Macquarie, even if it's only virtually. My wife Molly and I had a wonderful visit a decade ago, and Naren Chitty was a perfect host, and he's gone on obviously to create a truly impressive institution in SPARC. So I want to basically say that it's a pleasure for me to be able to celebrate the 10th anniversary of SPARC and to wish you well. I have been asked to talk about soft power, and I thought I might title my talk, Soft Power, the Origins and Political Progress of a Concept. And I will start with the fact that I coined the term soft power in my 1990 book, Bound to Lead, that challenged the then conventional wisdom that the United States was a declining power. After looking at American military and economic power resources, I felt that something was still missing, the ability to affect others by attraction and persuasion rather than just coercion and payment. At that time, there was a prevalent belief that the United States was in decline and that Paul Kennedy, who my friend, a distinguished historian at Yale, wrote about this in his book, The Rise and the Fall of the Great Powers, was a New York Times bestseller. Kennedy argued that the US was suffering from imperial overstretch and would soon go the way of 17th century Spain or Edwardian Britain. Many others echoed these thoughts and believed that the Soviet Union was passing the US. It's hard to remember that at this stage. And in military might, and that Japan was overtaking us in economic strength. I doubted this conventional wisdom and went to many seminars and conferences where I was a lonely dissenter. Both academics and practitioners in international relations tend to treat power as tangible resources you could drop on your foot or drop on a city. This was less true of classical realists like E.H. Carr or Hans Morgenthau, but it was particularly true of the new neo-realist theories like Kenneth Waltz and his followers, who became fashionable in the 1970s and 1980s. Everything was coercion and payments. But I believe that sometimes people influence others by ideas and attraction that sets the agenda for others and gets them to want what you want. Then carrots and sticks are less necessary and can be used more frugally because others see them as legitimate. With its universalistic culture and values and vast popular cultural resources ranging from Hollywood to foundations and universities, the United States seemed uniquely placed to affect how others viewed the world and us. Of course, it did not make us attractive to everyone, quite the contrary, as the mullahs in Iran proved. But where we were attractive, it was a huge advantage. As the Norwegian scholar Geir Lundstad once put it, if the Americans had created an empire in Europe, it was an empire by invitation, whereas, of course, the Soviet Empire in Europe was an empire by imposition. That's the important difference that soft power makes. I tried a variety of terms to try to summarize these thoughts and eventually settled on the term soft power. I hoped its slightly oxymoronic resonance in the traditional discourse of my field might make people think again about their assumptions when they spoke of power. I thought of soft power as an analytic concept to fill a deficiency in the way analysts thought about power, but it gradually took on political resonance as well as analytic purpose. In some ways, the underlying thought that I expressed in soft power is not new, and similar concepts can be traced back to ancient philosophers. In the Chinese tradition, Lao Tzu expresses many thoughts which would nowadays be considered soft power. But though I developed the term soft power in the context of my work on American power, it's not restricted to international behavior or to the United States. As I became interested in leadership studies, for example, I applied the concept to individuals and organizations in my 2008 book, The Powers to Lead. Nevertheless, it has taken particular root in international relations. And as the European Union grew, its leaders began to refer to the EU's soft power. The term was less used, however, by American political leaders, perhaps because the Americans had so much hard military power. I remember in 2002, I was invited to be a keynote speaker at a conference that was organized by the US Army in Washington. And I spoke to the assembled generals about soft power, and by their questions, they seemed to get it. Later, however, one of the generals asked the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, who was there, what he thought of soft power. He replied that he did not understand what soft power meant, and that has been evident in terms of his policies. This hubris was evident well before the security drama that followed the terrorist attacks on 9/11. But in that climate of fear, it was difficult to speak about soft power, even though attracting moderate Muslims away from appeals by jihadist radicals is a key component of any effective counterterrorism strategy. In that climate, and with the invasion of Iraq proving disastrous, I felt I needed to spell out the meaning of soft power in greater detail. Even colleagues like the historian Neil Ferguson wrote at the time that soft power refers to non-traditional forces such as cultural and commercial goods, and dismissed it on the grounds that it was, in his words, soft. And I don't think he misunderstood the concept, but that was the way in which he replied. And a congresswoman who was a friend of mine, Jane Harman from California, leading moderate Democrat, told me privately that she agreed 100% with my concept of soft power, but that as a practical politician, it was impossible to use it to address a political audience who wanted to hear tough talk. So in 2004, I decided to write a book which went into more detail conceptually, and that book was called Soft Power, the Means to Success in World Politics. I also said that soft power was only one component of power, and that it was rarely sufficient by itself. It tends to be slower, and it's not as much fully in control of governments. I also said that soft power should be thought of as a way to relate to other dimensions of power and call that smart power, the ability to make sure that soft and hard power reinforced rather than contradicted each other. Indeed, that term was later picked up by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton at the beginning of the Obama administration. In 2007, as the situation in Iraq continued to deteriorate, John Hamre, Richard Armitage, and I co-chaired what we called a Smart Power Commission based at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. It included a number of former senators and political figures, and we hope that with this membership, we could get soft power and smart power to be politically useful in centering American foreign policy. In 2007, for example, Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, who was then in the Bush administration, called for the US to invest more in soft power, which was one of the first explicit uses of the term by a high-level official in the US government. It was an interesting departure from the rather modest ambitions I had for an analytic concept, which I had scribbled out on my kitchen table some 17 years earlier. But even more interesting, I think, was the fate of the concept in China. As China dramatically developed its hard power resources, leaders realized that it would be more acceptable if it were accompanied by soft power. This is a smart strategy because as China's hard military and economic power grows, it may frighten its neighbors into balancing coalitions. If it can accompany its rise with an increase in its soft power, China can weaken the incentives for those coalitions. In 2007, Chinese President Hu Jintao told the 17th Party Congress of the Chinese Communist Party that they needed to invest more in their soft power. And thus, this policy has been continued by President Xi Jinping. Once the top leader had spoken and the word was out, billions of dollars were invested to promote soft power, and thousands of articles were published on the subject in China. But China has had a mixed success with its soft power strategy. Its impressive record of economic growth, of raising hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, has been very attractive to many people in other areas. And its traditional culture is also an important source of attraction. But polls show that it lags behind the United States in overall attractiveness in most parts of the world, including Asia. Portland, a consultancy in London that constructed an annual index of soft power, ranked China as number 28 out of the top 30 countries that it surveyed. Now, top-level endorsement of China affected me directly because hardly a week went by in the year after Hu Jintao's first use of the concept without an email asking me to write an article or participate in some soft power seminar or conference. Chinese officials have often contacted me in private conversations or for private conversations about how to increase China's soft power. My advice was always the same. I said that China could realize that should realize that most of a country's soft power comes from its civil society rather than from its government, and that government propaganda is often not credible. And if it's not credible, it does not attract and thus does not create soft power. And I said that China needs to give more leeway to the talents of its civil society, even though this is difficult to reconcile with tight party control. And Chinese soft power is also held back by territorial disputes with its neighbors. Creating a Confucius Institute to teach the glories of Chinese traditional culture in New Delhi, for example, will not generate attraction if Chinese troops are killing Indian soldiers on the Himalayan border. One of the most intriguing occasions I had in experiencing the use of soft power in China was an invitation to address the School of Marxism at Peking University. And I was treated very well. And when it came time for my lecture to some 1,500 students, I was seated alone at a table on a podium covered with gorgeous flowers, a large screen on the wall behind me with a large video of my performance. In the course of my speech, I addressed the question of how China could increase its soft power. And I mentioned the harassment of the great Chinese artist Ai Weiwei as an example of too tight party control over civil society. There's a slight titter in the crowd, but at the end of my lecture, the dean of the School of Marxism took the stage and gave a long, flowery thanks that the author of the concept of soft power had come to address the school. As he went on, however, I noted that my translator was skipping much of what he said. I later asked a friend who was present in the front row what the dean had said. My friend obviously spoke Mandarin and I did not. In summary, he said, we are flattered to have Professor Nye here, but you students must realize that his use of the concept is overly political, and we prefer to restrict it to cultural issues. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, China has tried to use so-called vaccine diplomacy to bolster its soft power. And of course, its Belt and Road Initiative is deployed to increase Chinese soft power in many parts of the world. But the results remain disappointing. As recent polls by Pew and Gallup show, China lags behind the US on all continents except Africa, where the two are tied. One reason is that Chinese nationalism and heavy-handedness has basically undercut their soft power. They've stepped on their own message, as advertising people say. It is difficult to practice vaccine diplomacy and wolf warrior diplomacy at the same time. I think we saw this in the heavy-handedness of China's demands on Australia in the last year or so. So China's problems do not come without some difficulties, which I think will be hard for them to remedy. And on the other hand, the fact that China is having problems with its soft power doesn't mean that all is well with American soft power. The Trump years were not kind to American soft power. The idea that polls had already showed a decline in our attractiveness in other countries after 2017 was compounded by Trump's incompetence in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. And this was followed rather by the shock of a mob invading the Capitol, urged on by the president. Republican Senator Ben Sass of Nebraska said that, in his words, today the world's greatest symbol of self-government was ransacked while the leader of the free world cowered behind his keyboard, tweeting against his own vice president for fulfilling the duties of his oath to the Constitution. Needless to say, America's allies and other countries were shocked, and many people raised the question of whether the US soft power could recover from these blows. It's an open question. And I don't know the answer, nor does anybody else. But if one looks at history, it's interesting to note that there have been prior periods where American soft power has suffered severe declines, and the US has recovered from it. Our country still has serious problems, but it has a capacity for resilience and reform that has rescued us in the past. In the 1960s, for example, our cities were burning over racial protests, and we were mired in Vietnam War protests. Bombs exploded in universities. Indeed, one went off in my own building at Harvard University. And we were mired in a terrible dispute. National Guard troops killed students at Kent State University. We witnessed the assassination of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, and the flames were fanned by demagogues like George Wallace. Yet within a decade, a series of reforms passed Congress, and the honesty of Gerald Ford and the human rights policies of Jimmy Carter and the optimism of Ronald Reagan helped to restore America's attractiveness. Moreover, even when crowds were marching through the world's streets protesting American policies in Vietnam, the protesters sang Martin Luther King's "We Shall Overcome" more than the Communist Internationale. In other words, an anthem that came from the civil rights protest movement illustrated that America's power to attract rested not on our government's policies, but in large part on our civil society and our capacity to be self-critical and to reform. A country's soft power comes primarily from three sources: its culture, when that culture is attractive to others; its political values, such as democracy and human rights, when it lives up to them; and its policies, when they're seen as legitimate. How a country behaves at home, for example, protecting a free press and the right to protest, in international institutions by consulting others in multilateralism, and in foreign policy by promoting development and human rights, can attract others by example. The Trump years set an example which was quite bad, but there is a prospect that we may recover from it. For one thing, unlike hard power assets such as armed forces, many soft power resources are separate from government and attract others to our country despite politics. Hollywood movies that showcase independent women or protesting minorities can attract others. So too does our diverse free press, as well as the charitable works of US foundations and the freedom of inquiry at American universities. Firms, universities, foundations, churches, and protest movements develop soft power of their own, which may reinforce others' views of our country. Our peaceful protests can actually generate soft power. Of course, the mob in the Capitol was far from peaceful, and it provided a disturbing illustration of the way that Trump has exacerbated political polarization. But it was not a coup. On the contrary, the center held, the institutions worked, and the certification of Biden's election went ahead. We've had an increase in political polarization in the United States over the past 2 decades, and it worries me, as well as many of my compatriots. Trump exploited and exacerbated nativist populism as a political weapon to take control of the Republican Party. Many senators and Congress members are cowed by threats of a primary challenge by members of Trump's base. But in our federal system, it's also local officials, Republicans, Democrats, and independents who did the honest job of carrying out an election under pandemic conditions. Our democratic political culture produced many local heroes, such as the secretaries and state legislatures who stood up to Trump's efforts to intimidate them into changing votes. So for those who mourn American democracy prematurely, it's important to remember that the 2020 election saw an unprecedented turnout of voters who were able to unseat a demagogue. And it was sustained in more than 60 court cases overseen by an independent judiciary, including some of Trump's own appointees. Now, this does not mean that all is well for American democracy. Trump has eroded a number of democratic norms that must be restored. Polarization persists, as I said, and a significant portion of Trump's base believes his lies about the election being stolen rather than seeing the evidence of the courts as proving that it was not. Social media, moreover, have a business model which tends to exacerbate the problems of extremism. The algorithms which determine how you get clicks and therefore advertising are designed not deliberately to create extremism, but have been proven to have that effect. So this is a longer term trend, which goes far beyond just the election or defeat of Donald Trump. So far, if you look at the presidency of Joe Biden, it has been relatively calming. But on the other hand, there are still great uncertainties in American politics. While it's too soon to be sure whether Biden can tame the pandemic and revive the economy and provide a political center that eases the polarization, it's possible that this political period, which has been so dangerous, is one which we can overcome. If so, American resilience will again lead to recovery of American soft power. But as I said, nobody knows for certain. I am speculating on the future of Chinese and American soft power. I feel somewhat more secure, actually, in my projections that China faces difficulties in overcoming the obstacles to its soft power that come out of its conflicts with neighbors and its insistence on tight party control. Whether in the American democracy we'll overcome polarization and be able to remain an attractive source of values, I think it worries me more, but I still have a residual optimism, which I think I've tried to justify by my comments with the comparison to the recovery from the 60s. But one thing we can be sure about, even if we can't be sure about my projections about a Chinese or American soft power, we can be sure that soft power will be important, perhaps even increasingly important in world politics. And we can also rejoice that SPARC will be here to study it. So thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Nye, for a wonderful and expansive coverage of the topic. I was particularly drawn to your comparison of the US and China. What I'd like to do now is propose that we ask each member of the panel just to say a couple of minutes of response to the remarks that Professor Nye has made. And I might call on Mr. Peter Varghese first. Mr. Peter Varghese, AO, the current Chancellor of the University of Queensland, former senior diplomat for Australia as the High Commissioner to India and the Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Peter?
Well, thank you very much, Bruce. And can I also thank Professor Nye for a typically erudite lecture. Australia tends to sort of be very ambivalent about hard power, but I think we're much more comfortable with the concept of soft power, not least because it's not directly linked to scale or economic and strategic heft. But I really just want to make 2 points. The first is to pick up a theme in Professor Nye's lecture, which is the link between perceptions and credibility, because credibility is at the heart of soft power. There's nothing more corrosive, I think, to soft power than a perception of hypocrisy. Hard power realists tend to be quite dismissive about the role of hypocrisy because they see it as a routine part of statecraft. But the general public, who are the ultimate graders of soft power, I think, mark down a gap between what you say and what you do as a nation. And I think smaller powers, middle powers, actually pay a bigger price for this than great powers do, because often great powers can get away with it. The second point I wanted to make was a more complex geopolitical environment also means a more complex soft power environment. And certainly in an Australian context, this has implications for how we position ourselves in Asia. It will put an increasing premium, in my view, on a much more nuanced understanding of a more multipolar Asia. And that means that as part of our soft power diplomacy, Australia will need a revised narrative of Asian engagement, one that recognizes a more divided region, a more nuanced region, which can't be forced into a one-size story of Asian engagement. And part of that repositioning, I think, is going to be a much more creative use of groups and networks outside of government, because hard power is in the gift of government, soft power essentially is beyond the control of government. For instance, I think Australia will need to take much more advantage of its diaspora groups to spread a message about the country, to draw on their networks and their cultural understanding. The best way of blunting a view that Australia is charging back to an Anglosphere is actually through the voices of diaspora communities in Australia speaking to Australian multiculturalism. So the last thing I'll say is we, more than most in Australia, depend on our ability to persuade. We can't buy or bully our way in the world, and soft power therefore matters to us because it's the ultimate test of our ability to persuade. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Peter. Maybe we'll keep going and collect the comments of the panelists, and then maybe Professor Nye would like to add some further comments. Maybe I might turn into Professor Caitlin Byrne, the director of the Griffith Asia Institute at Griffith University. Welcome, Caitlin.
Thank you so much, Bruce, and just such a pleasure to be here. I'm joining you from the traditional lands of the Turrbal and Jagera peoples here in Brisbane. And Professor Nye, this is certainly a highlight for me. I've been really always inspired by the work you've done on soft power. And I think it has offered us in the foreign policy world a really welcome counterpoint to the neo-realist discourse that has dominated so much of our thinking over time. And I would absolutely agree with Peter Varghese. Australia, more than many, as a middle power, really has to think very seriously about its soft power assets and utilising the tools of persuasion to set agendas, to build coalitions, to work in partnerships, particularly now in an era of contest and competition. And I think wherever we see the competition for power, we see a competition for story. And Australia needs to think about how soft power fits into the strength of story, the strength of narrative, how we present ourselves to the world as we think about the kind of order that we want to see in the world. COVID-19 has, of course, amplified the need for soft power, particularly for a country like Australia that is a long-haul destination, where we have typically relied on the exposure to people and place as a part of our soft power attraction. More than ever, I think we're starting to hone in on some of those core features of competency, particularly in our diplomatic tradecraft. More than ever, and I think we've seen this over the last 2 weeks, watching the events of the G20, of COP26, of APEC, more than ever, we need competence in our diplomatic practitioners and our network to engage effectively on the global stage. Secondly, of course, we need credibility, and that point of matching our policy in deed and in word has never been more compelling. And I think at the moment we're in a real crisis stage. And thirdly, I think we need to see soft power starting at home. This was certainly a lesson through COVID-19 in the way that we engaged with international students here in Australia. I guess I'll just finish by saying I don't necessarily think that we have actually grappled sufficiently with the concept of soft power for an Australian experience, and for an experience where we are situated here in the Asia Pacific region. In 2004, Paul Kelly wrote in a paper titled Shipwrecked in Arcadia that at that point, Australia's singular and recent failure lies in its ability to conceptualise soft power. I would argue that nearly 2 decades later, that comment remains. And I think we need to really focus on building analytical purchase in what is an Australian experience and move beyond some of the political rhetoric and criticisms of soft power as superficial, weak, or soft, to realise what it can actually achieve for us in an era of contest. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Caitlin. Among the number of comments you made there, I'm particularly drawn to the conception of the power of story. And I think we in Australia have a job to do to reflect very deeply on the power of story in the Indigenous peoples of Australia long before colonisation, to think about the creation of that society, which was relatively peaceful compared to the world we see today. So thank you, Caitlin. Perhaps I might turn now to Professor Evelyn Goh, the Shedden Professor of Strategic Policy Studies at the Australian National University. Welcome to you, Evelyn.
Thank you, Professor Dowton, and thank you for this opportunity to reconnect with Professor Nye as well. Hi, Joe.
Hi, good to see you.
I join you from sunny Canberra, where it's finally stopped raining, and it's a pleasure to be with you. Professor Nye, thank you so much for what was a very valuable reflection on, I think, the milieu in which you developed the concept of soft power. And I think that helps us to have that conversation about the degree and extent to which this vastly important concept has traveled over the last 30 years or so. And maybe I can add a couple of thoughts on how we might think of this in the context of the US-China comparison and relationship, which you've touched upon as well. When I've sort of engaged with your concept of soft power, 2 things have always struck me. The first is what I alluded to just now, this idea that, the most important concepts are products of their milieu. And you've reminded us that, the origins of this in the United States context has been sort of towards the end of the Cold War, the 1990s, when for the rest of the world, what we were experiencing, right, was that consolidation of US hegemony, if I may put it that way, a consensual hegemony. And what was remarkable about that context was the confluence of dominant, multi-spectrum dominance of power by the United States, whether we're talking about the military, the economic, or the pop cultural realms, or the realm of sort of a superior form of political organization. And I think that unusual context is important to remember when we think about the China comparison as well, because we see a similar degree of dominance of multispectral power if we think about the dominant, the sort of period in which we might think of China having that sort of dominant soft power. Of course, I'm referring to the earlier historical period particularly at its peak around the 17th century, when we could identify a Sinic system, particularly in East Asia. We see the same confluence of a dominance of what is often called civilizational power, but really power that had, very important economic dimensions, very important dimensions of China having a form of political organization that was clearly superior and worth emulating from polities in its surroundings. And most importantly, of course, a dominance of a cultural imagination that had a cosmological understanding of the human condition and purpose, which allowed China to occupy that position of what was called a central fluorescence. Very bad translation, but you get where I'm going. And we have those two parallel periods in which we have that multi-spectrum dominance of power. Now, what's really interesting when we think about it today, of course, is that there's a much more plural, Peter's referred to this already, much more plural international system in which there is not sort of one dominant model, if you like, or one dominant power that has that full spectrum dominance. And so that changes the context of how we think about soft power and reduces it, as you said, to one instrument in a toolkit of power. And in that context, I think if we go back to your original concept, which was pinned on two modes of power, I think, attraction on the one hand and persuasion on the other. The attraction part has paradoxically less traction in a plural system. Attraction, after all, is a fairly sort of passive concept, isn't it? You look for a constituency that already shares your values, right? And you hope that that gives you a pre-laid foundation for collaboration and for amplification of power. But persuasion is a different thing. You've actually got to change others' calculations of priorities and benefits. You've got to convert other people's thinking. And that really is the primary mode of exercise of soft power today, whether it's for the United States or for China, because it's a more plural, competitive environment in which neither has a very clear full spectrum dominance of power. And I think it's in that context that we can understand the difficulties that both China and the United States are respectively having, as you've already outlined, Professor Nai. So this leads me to simply thank you for this tour de force and for this important reminder that the questions that you began grappling with in the late 1980s remain just as pertinent for us today, trying to navigate this fast-changing global environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Evelyn. I might turn now to our Chancellor of Macquarie University, Dr. Martin Parkinson, AC, a distinguished leader in Australian government, having served as the Secretary of Prime Minister and Cabinet in Canberra for the Australian government before he joined us a couple of years ago as our Chancellor. Dr. Parkinson. Sure, we have Martin coming in.
Yep.
There.
Thanks, Bruce. Apologies for that. Professor Nye, that was fantastic. As a long-time sort of reader of your work, it's just been absolutely a huge pleasure to hear you reflect back on its progress. I want to make a couple of observations and then a question. The observations are really echoing Peter and Caitlin. It seems to me international education is a great way to boost soft power, but we have seen in this country government making it harder for international students to come to Australia. And it's in a sense almost because there's not a broad conception of soft power in the way in which government thinks about projecting at the moment, we're actually making the task for us harder. Whereas, as Peter was saying, to succeed in this environment, we need to be better at it. And picking up what Caitlin was saying, the use of diplomacy and credibility of policy our experience in the G20 and COP in recent weeks has shown not a failure of diplomacy, in my view, but an absence of both diplomacy and policy credibility. And again, in the absence of either of those things, you cannot have effective exercise of soft power. But you said in your talk that tough talk seems to resonate with politicians. And indeed, it is quite striking in Australia at the moment about the conversation regarding China and Taiwan. There is chest beating from Australian politicians and very little discussion about either China's soft power with respect to Taiwan or Australia's, where based on your three characteristics of culture, values and policies, we have considerable strength, even if we're not very good at perhaps at the moment at utilising it. So I suppose the question is it possible in this era of both strategic competition and collaboration to balance hard versus soft power? Or are we inevitably going to move to greater and greater reliance on hard power? Thank you.
That's a very good question, Martin. And I might ask Professor Nye to respond to that question. Just let our audience colleagues know that the Q&A function on this Zoom call is open. There are a couple of questions come in. So perhaps after I provide Professor Nye a chance to respond to Dr. Parkinson's question, I'll then ask Naren Chitty to make a couple of remarks and introduce a couple of the questions if we have time. Professor Nye, would you care to reflect on Dr. Parkinson's question there?
Well, they are all very good comments, but let me, since you asked, I will focus particularly on Dr. Parkinson's question. That ability to reconcile hard and soft power is why I developed this term smart power, because if they reinforce each other, then they are a force multiplier, but very often they cancel each other out. And so when you use hard power in a way which is unattractive to others, you can undercut and destroy your soft power. It's worth remembering that in the early days of the Cold War, communism and Soviet Union had a great deal of attraction because they had stood up against fascism in Europe. But when the Soviets destroyed the Hungarian efforts to open up their country, or the Czech efforts, basically they undercut the soft power that they had. So by the time of the wall going down, there was very little left. And remember, the wall went down not under hammers or bulldozers, not under artillery, but under hammers and bulldozers wielded by people whose minds had been changed. So to argue that soft power doesn't matter is wrong, but just notice that the time dimensions we're talking about when we talk about soft power are quite long. And or rather than picking just on the Soviets, if you look at George Bush, there was the George W. Bush, there was a great deal of sympathy for American soft power in America after 9/11, but the invasion of Iraq without a UN mandate meant that Bush was able to use American hard power to destroy Saddam Hussein quite easily, but at the cost of undercutting American soft power in most of the world. But most important, the use of American hard power basically reinforced the divisions within Iraq, which gave the opportunity for the rise of ISIS, the Islamic State. So there's a case where the hard power and soft power canceled each other out, the United States case. The Soviet case, the hard power and soft power cancel each other out. But I would argue that 1989, when you look at it in the longer perspective, is a case where American deterrence through military force, but the exchange of ideas across the Iron Curtain had a very powerful impact. So again, combining the two is difficult, but it is important and it makes a difference.
Well, thank you very much. We might turn now to Professor Naren Chitty, a comment, and then perhaps maybe there are some audience questions. Naren.
Thank you, Bruce. Joe, as a liberal realist, your self-description, you said that you start with a realist lens, and if that doesn't measure up for the context, you add a liberalist lens. You have said that neoliberalism that you founded with Keohane was never meant to be purely liberal. A previous speaker in this series, Nicholas Onaf, was a co-founder of constructivism. Nick was also the chair of my doctoral thesis committee. He said that we make the world with our words and deeds, and then the world makes us. You repeatedly warned against treating the present geopolitical context as a Cold War. Constructivists would argue that if you characterize the situation in a certain way, your policies and actions could lead to a kind of wish fulfillment. The other party would respond in kind. And of course, there are lots of moving parts between words and policies and deeds and preferred outcomes. The Reagan administration encouraged globalization that intended complex interdependence, the latter term being coined by you and Keohane. But George Shultz, and I was there when he spoke about it at the press club, called the balance of interdependence, has at least for the moment become an imbalance of vulnerability. The impulse towards ensuring resource security has dented complex interdependence, at least for the moment. Perhaps it has resilience. There are some features in the current geopolitical climate that smack a little bit of a Cold War, even if we don't use the term. At least there has been an audible Scold War, S-C-O-L-D, one that has damaged public diplomacy. The need to shore up public support at home has encouraged the leaders of many countries to follow Mr. Trump in the exercise of blunt power. Even countries that have been admired for diplomacy have been tempted to conduct spats in public. There is perhaps a need for more in-camera than on-camera diplomacy to unravel snarls and what Peter called chest beating and so on. Something else I want to say was that, and this has some reference to what Evelyn said. See, I follow Laswell and Kaplan's definition of power and influence. And for Laswell and Kaplan, power is intended influence. So there's a whole bunch of stuff which is called unintended influence. And that includes unintended attraction-based influence. And I think that's very, and I don't want to use the word powerful here because it doesn't make sense, but it has an enormous influence. And really, I mean, you can go back to George Washington's final speech when he spoke of virtue and how in the future this will influence other countries. Now, there may not have been a policy intention there, and there's a huge gap between then and now. But a lot of it has become, in my view, unintended influence of ordinary people, as it were, quite outside of government policy. So those are my comments. And then there are a couple of questions. Would you like to read the questions out now?
Well, perhaps we. Yes,
I was wondering if I could reply to Naren's questions before we have the new questions.
Please.
I think your point is very well taken, Naren. And in my new book, Do Morals Matter? Presidents in Foreign Policy from FDR to Trump, I deliberately called myself a liberal realist because I thought that this idea that it's one or the other is mistaken. And I think that you have to have the realist basis in place before you add the concerns of liberalism or cosmopolitanism. And I think that too many people see it as either or. And I think the point that you mentioned, Nicholas Onuff, saying that words shape us and they shape how we do things. I've been writing a good deal of things in the US opposing the idea of calling the US-China relationship a Cold War. It's very fashionable in Washington now to refer to the new Cold War. And I had an article in the New York Times op-ed page a week or so ago saying this is disastrous. It's going to shape our thinking the wrong way. For one thing, we were never so interdependent with the Soviet Union as we are with China. And it's not just economic interdependence, it's also ecological interdependence. Neither of us can solve large problems like pandemics or climate acting alone. So if we use words that shape our thinking into Cold War and hard power only, we're going to lose. I called this a three-dimensional chess game that we're involved in, and that if you play two-dimensional chess in such a game, you're going to lose. So I think your point is well taken, and that's why I think it's very important not to degenerate into this. You do need to pay attention to the balance of power. That's where the realists are correct, but you have to go beyond that. And that's where I think they have to pay attention to soft power as well as these new transnational issues. So I agree with what you said, and I agree with what Evelyn said, and you mentioned again, that persuasion is more difficult than attraction.
Thanks very much, Professor Nye. We might just turn to one question which I might pose, which is all we'll have time for, and then I'll ask our Chancellor, Dr. Parkinson, to move a vote of the thanks. Let me ask you, Professor Nye, one of our listeners has asked, does religion have any role in your view to play in the display of soft power in the world today?
Oh, absolutely. Religion attracts and persuades many, many people. And therefore, to neglect religion in the analysis of world politics is a huge mistake. It's also true that religion can work in different ways. For example, Osama bin Laden, when he persuaded these people to fly into the World Trade Center, didn't threaten them with coercion, didn't pay them. He attracted them with a particular distorted view of Islam. So religion can attract people, and the same religion that may attract one set of people may not attract or repel another set. But is religion important? Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much. We're almost at the hour, and Professor Nye does have a hard stop. So maybe I'll just ask our Chancellor, Dr. Martin Parkinson, to move a vote of thanks. Chancellor.
Thank you, Bruce. And I just invite panel members to come back on so we can grab a couple of photos before we wrap up. Professor Nye, whether and how to deploy power is always a conundrum, and never more so than in the sort of fluid and changing environment of the sort that we're confronting today. The transition of economic weight from transatlantic towards Asia is playing out in real time, challenging the institutions and rules that have governed activity over the last 70 years. And while it's important to acknowledge that global rules are always being remade, I think one of the things that's really striking now is that that is usually evolutionary and more in the way of retuning. And what we're seeing today is a challenge that goes to the heart of who writes the rules, not just the rules themselves. But as you've pointed out in other dimensions, economic weight does not automatically bestow global strategic power or influence. And the key influence or key issue is not whether the US is in relative economic decline or whether we're seeing the end of the American century, which is often the sort of debate that one sees in the press. The really critical issue is that the US remains central to efforts to galvanise institutions and other nations to address the challenges of the global commons, whether they be climate change or pandemics, and deliver on the sorts of global public goods in terms of rules and institutions that have helped give us the sort of benefits of the last 70 years. But as we've seen with the recent COP and the G20 meetings, the likelihood of success has been much reduced from what we've become used to in recent decades. And that's reflecting this diffusion of power, both amongst nation states and from nations to non-state actors. And it means that for countries like Australia and the US, we both need to operate differently. We need to be more strategic in identifying our core national interests, to be more agile in how we respond to events, and to adopt careful, thoughtful strategies. And unlike in recent years, not see international relations solely through the prism of domestic politics. Now, as you yourself have pointed out, in this world, ad hoc reactions to events is not enough. Success requires smart power strategies, one that use all of the instruments of power to advance our national interest. And a world where the US and China are speaking and doing deals on trade and climate change, but Australian ministers and officials cannot even pick up the phone to their Chinese colleagues, suggests that a smart power strategy is absent on our behalf in particular. It's been a huge privilege for all of us to have had the opportunity to spend the last hour with you and to hear your reflections on these issues, and also to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the establishment of the Soft Power Analysis and Resource Centre, some 18 years after the establishment of this, the lecture in honour of Bruce Allen. Colleagues, not only has Professor Nye's presentation been intellectually stimulating and thought-provoking, it comes at a time when a number of the panel members have referenced the challenges of balancing cooperation and strategic competition in the Indo-Pacific has become the central international relations and diplomatic issue confronting Australia. We've been incredibly fortunate to have been joined today by my fellow Chancellor and good friend Peter Varghese, himself the deliverer of the 2013 Oration, and Professors Byrne, Evelyn and Macquarie's own Naren Chitty. It's a testament to the importance of the issues that Professor Nye has been discussing that we've been able to bring together such a panel and to be joined by others in the audience who've made such significant contributions to Australian thinking on these issues. So on that note, let me on your behalf thank again Professor Nye and our panel, and really wish every one of you the very best for the forthcoming holiday season. So Professor Nye, thank you very much. We've been honoured by your participation in this event. Thank you.
Thank you.